seems to me that the themes that I saw emerging from your works are where's entrepreneurship happening and who is doing it? And is this something that we do? Lisa said this is kind of interesting to me. Is entrepreneurship a backup plan because corporations can't do it internally? Are we financing it correctly? Are we teaching people how to do entrepreneurship correctly? And I thought I would just add one little thing to it. And that is, I do think that in the end, Drucker and Schumpeter were essentially right. And the observation is that you can't invest internally, and therefore entrepreneurship is a backup plan. And it entails trying and failing and trying and failing and victoring differently and failing, and some of them succeed. But they exist because it's a backup plan. We haven't learned how to do it internally and and so on. And I just wanted to give a couple observations that takes me to the belief that in the end, maybe we really can teach people how to be innovative inside of corporations if we do it in a powerful way. So a number of years ago, I was minding my own business one day when I received a call from William Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense when Clinton was our president. And elsewhere we call it the Minister of Defense, we call him the Secretary of Defense. And he asked me if I would come down to the Pentagon to teach his staff about my research about innovation. And for me, it was a chance of a lifetime, so I went down there. And there were about 45 people in his office. And he introduced me to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the secretaries of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and all of the undersecretaries and deputy secretaries and assistant secretaries of everything. So about 45 people there. And Secretary Cohen asked me to just talk to them about my research, about disruption. And so I described how there's a tendency for the company innovations that kill disruptive companies start at the bottom of the market and go up. And they kill the incumbents not by taking them head on, but by launching what we call disruptive innovations, starting in simple tiers of the market and then go up. And then I said, to illustrate how this works in a company, I want to tell them how it worked in steel, and described how at the bottom of the market there's concrete reinforcing bar or rebar and other more sophisticated products until you came to the top of the market, which was sheet steel used to make cars. And I described how historically all of these products were made by integrating big integrated steel companies like U.S. Steel or Gohovens and so on. And then I described how a new disruptive innovation called mini mills that melt scrap in electric furnaces came at the bottom of the market and went up. And as they went from the bottom of the market, the integrated steel companies were happy to get rid of that because their margins improved as they went up market themselves. And many of you know the model as I've tried to describe it. Anyway, when I described how disruption had killed the integrated steel companies in that industry, General Shelton, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, raised his hand and he said, "Clay, you're clueless about why we're interested in your model, aren't you?" And I confessed that I was clueless. And he said, "Well, leave that diagram of disruption on the market on the screen. And he stood up and he leaned out the word sheet steel. That's the most demanding market for people in steel. He crossed that out and he said, for us, that's the Russians. They're the most demanding foes. And then he said, what you call the integrated steel companies, we call that the U.S. Department of Defense. And we try to do everything for everybody. And then he looked at the bottom of the market, which we had labeled as rebar, or concrete reinforcing bar. And he crossed that out and he said, for us, that's terrorism. And what you'll call as the mini mills, starting out with terrorism and then screaming up market, we call that non-nation nations like Al-Qaeda. And they are racing up market, and there isn't anything about the way we're organized that would help us good at tackling terrorism. And then he sat down. And all of a sudden, all of the hands in the audience went up, and the questions were all around, have there been any examples of companies that were the leaders of an industry which, when they got disrupted by something coming at the bottom, survived rather than get killed? And I said, yeah, there have been a few, but in every case, the companies that survived or even thrived when this happened always occurred when they set up a completely different business unit. And it had to be different because the economics are different, the processes are different, the cost structure and the organizational infrastructure had to be very different. But if they set it up separately, there are a few examples of survivorship or even success. And we argued and discussed this for about 2 hours, and then we ran out of time. 2 months later, Secretary Cohen called me up again, and he said, you need to know that today we're announcing that we're setting up a different organization, separate from the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, and we're calling it the Special Forces Command, that we're going to organize to fight terrorism. And he said, you need to know that we have been arguing about how to organize ourselves to tackle terrorism. We've been arguing about it for 6 years, but there's no data about what we should do. And so somebody would make a recommendation and support it with data, and then somebody else would make a recommendation and support it with different data. And the data was never consistent. And he said, what your research has done is it gave us a common language and a common way to frame the problem so that we could reach consensus around a counterintuitive course of action. And to me, that was just a brilliant insight from him. And that is that an academic actually can make a substantial difference if we give people who use our research a common language and a common way to frame the problem. Then the manager knows what to do with it. And we're about out of time, and so maybe I better stop there. But I think that some of the best research that I see emerging is emerging in a way that causes me to say they're theories of causality. And knowing that it's causal, I see investors who, instead of being right 10% or 20% of the time, can get it right 90% of the time. And I think in the end, or I hope that it's actually true, that entrepreneurship is a backup plan as we learn more and more about how to innovate every time correctly.